Our next speaker is Andy Mueller. He's general manager of the Colorado River District, and last year he spoke, and it was his first time, his first year on the job. I don't know what you said, Andy, but it blew up the taping system, and whatever you said last year is lost.
He prefers it that way.
And he prefers it that way. But we're gonna do a lot better this year. We're gonna remember every word you said, and we're gonna have it repeated on the local television channel. So without further ado, here's our general manager to talk about big river issues, big picture Colorado Basin issues.
Well, thank you, Jim. I appreciate it. I think the program that Jim prepared said I'm going to talk about something called drought contingency plans. And I'll tell you, I will get to that at the end, but I think in order to understand why the 7 states and the federal government and the country of Mexico are talking about drought contingency plans on the Colorado River, you first have to look at what we've been doing to that river and what's been going on there before we can get to it. And I want to start out by introducing you a little bit to the Colorado River District. Anyone here who owns property, I want to tell you that I greatly appreciate your tax dollars. We are a regional government, 15 county-wide government that was formed in 1937 as at the direct request of residents of the Western Slope who saw the Colorado Big Thompson project coming in and said that we on the Western Slope need a unified voice on water issues to protect our interests in the state, and that we need some single voice that can actually counterbalance the Front Range interests that were looking at that time at all of these Trans Mountain diversions. Our district was formed again in '37 with a small tax levy. At that time, it was 2.5 mills were authorized by the legislature. We also were given the authority and the power to assist the state of Colorado's government in defending Colorado's share or apportionment of the Colorado River. So our little regional government that's based in Glenwood Springs does work throughout the Western Slope, and then also we are in the 7 basin state discussions quite frequently, assisting our state government in ways, things like modeling, legal advice, technical work, engineering advice, to help our state really do its best job for all of its citizens. If I can, Karin Stegelmeyer is here, and Karin is our Summit County representative on our board. She's one of 15 board members, so she's my boss. I have to call her out. But no, Karin's awesome, and I really appreciate the fact that the county commissioners have found it advisable to send Karin, because she's fantastic, and we really do appreciate that. I do want to talk a little bit about our mill levy. Today, due to the effects primarily of Tabor, we are at 1/10 of what the legislature authorized us to have. So we are at a point, we're about 1/4 of a mill, 0.252 mils. We're capped at that rate. That brings in approximately $4.3 million a year in tax revenue. For an average homeowner, what that means is it's about the price of a gallon of milk.
Don't put your arm on the mic.
Okay, thanks. It's about the price of a gallon of milk that, that each of you pay. So if you go back and look at your tax bill and find the Colorado River Water Conservation District, we are usually the lowest or second lowest taxing entity on your bill. And we do appreciate that. With that, by the way, we have a staff today. Well, at the end of this year, we'll have a staff of 21. When I came in last year, we had a staff of 26. We've had to downsize due to our economic issues caused by both the Tabor and primarily the Gallagher Amendment. We also have a large segment of our district is in oil and gas producing counties, and the market for oil and gas has been in the decline since 2013, and we've just seen our revenues being affected by that. I will tell you that to date, we feel like we have done a very good job of living within the budget set by the voters and under Tabor, and we are downsizing in order to do that. I am concerned when we look out 5, 10, 15, and 20 years in the future that our ability to meet our mission and protect West Slope water from incursions from the east or problems that great sucking sound you hear down in Arizona will be diminished due to our lack of tax dollars. So it is possible that in 2020 you will be hearing from us at the ballot. Our board of directors is looking at that, trying to understand what the best solution to this problem is. But I want to let you know that our first reaction was not to go out and raise taxes, but we've actually been cutting costs throughout the district and really focusing on how to use your money wisely at the district. Some of the stuff we do on your behalf, you may be familiar, we assisted tremendously with the Old Dillon Reservoir in design and construction. We led in the Colorado River Cooperative agreement negotiations with Denver. And through that, we're now seeing the implementation coming into this county and other, Grand County and other counties on the West Slope through the funds that Denver had agreed to pay back from its use of its system and the water that they take from the Western Slope here in this county. We are also working hard on fulfilling other elements of the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement that deal with the power plant down in Glenwood Canyon that keeps, due to its senior water rights, the water flowing west instead of additional diversions going east. And so we're very involved in those discussions. One of the other things that we do, this coordinated releases for recreational environmental needs, it's really a coordinated reservoir operation system, CROSS, which is what Victor talks about. And it's not just for recreational environmental needs, it's for agricultural users throughout the system. But every week, these reservoir operators, Victor and Denver and Colorado Springs and our office, get on the phone and they work through amazing details as to how to keep these rivers in balance up here on the Western Slope. Most of the time they do pretty well. Frankly, when Mother Nature hands them a bad situation like last year, I think they did a remarkable job. Little of that was helped down in the upper Colorado, only because we were doing reservoir maintenance on Wolford Mountain Reservoir that we own, and so we actually released a bunch of water, which brought the temperatures way down and the flows up. So the fish population that really looked stressed actually did much better than they would have. But we do things like that, and then we're also actively involved in protecting the headwaters from new and expanded trans-mountain diversions. A classic example of this, you heard Colorado Springs, Casalem up here talking about it. That Montgomery Reservoir enlargement is a right that they have had on the books, but it's a conditional water right. So when they file their conditional water right application every 6 years, our district gets involved and is involved currently in those discussions, looking out, along with some of your local entities, looking out at how we can improve timing and stream flow and temperatures in the upper blue, so that that system, when and if it's built by Colorado Springs, won't cause irreparable harm or additional irreparable harm to the fishery and to the environment here in Summit County. And our lawyers and our engineers are actively working on things like that right now. So I want to talk about the bigger river issues now, if I can. Just real quick, I want to talk about why we have this problem on the Colorado River. So on paper, the lower basin gets a 7.5 million acre foot allocation. It's the first allocation. So if there's only 7.5 million acre feet in the river, they get it. So they're kind of the first in time, first in right, if you think about it, just like we have up here. The upper basin gets the next 7.5 million acre feet. And you'll note, I think most of you are aware, we're in the upper basin over there, right where that arrow is in Colorado. About 70% of the water that flows in the entire Colorado River comes off the west slope of Colorado. So, but we're limited as the upper basin, those 4 upper basin states, to 7.5 million acre feet. The next million acre feet comes out of the lower basin tributaries, and this is under the 1922 compact. They get another million acre foot bonus. Then we each owe a quarter, well, arguably it's all owed by the lower basin, but there's some very screwy language that we may owe 3/4 million acre feet as well. So another 1.5 million acre feet. So on paper, that's 17.5 million acre feet. doesn't really mean a lot if you're not used to seeing what an acre foot is, but picture a football field covered in 1 foot of water, right? That's great, but what are we actually using, right? So 7.5 million down on the main stem, they're using everything in the lower basin. We, in the upper basin, are using 4 to 4.5 million acre feet. So 3 to 3.5 million less than we were allocated under the 1922 compact. The lower basin is also losing an additional 1 to 1.5 million acre feet in reservoir evaporation and transit losses, system delivery losses. So they get that. There's another 2 to 2.5 million, not that 1 million, but the 2 to 2.5 million coming out and being used out of their lower basin tributaries. Then there's the 1.5 million acre foot to Mexico, for a total of 16 to 17.5 million acre feet, right? So that must be a number that was based in science if that's what the paper said we're doing and this is what we're actually using. Well, the problem is right here that the compact was signed right at this point. If I can explain this chart, and basically on this side, it's the annual flow at Lee Ferry, just below Glen Canyon Dam. So it's where our deliveries out of Lake Powell get measured on the river. And so if you look at the natural flow, what would be if we weren't using the water, so you can reconstruct that flow and say, hey, this is what's naturally would have flown there, flowed at that point. We went back to 1875. The gauging obviously gets better as you go forward. The first several years here to 1906 were actually reconstructed from some gauges down in Yuma and other places, and then extrapolated up the river. So it's a little bit fuzzy, but when that same technique is used later, it's not that far off. So the orange line that barely moves, except it starts to trend downward here, is the running average to date. So it's every year averaged out. The gray line is a 10-year running average. The compact was signed in 1922. That's when the river was at its highest. Now, a lot of people will say, oh, those poor folks, they didn't know back then that there wasn't enough water in the river. They were living in times of surplus. Well, there are Bureau of Reclamation engineers, or were back at that time, telling the politicians who signed the 1922 compact that there wasn't enough water. Don't agree to split it the way you are. And our politicians, oddly enough, didn't want to listen to the scientists. Shocking, right? So they had already done this reconstruction work. They knew what really was out there. They'd seen some really low years. So you go forward, right, all the way out to 2019. And I want to point out that this line right here in the middle is 15 million acre feet. And remember, on paper and on actual use, we're using 17.5, somewhere between 16 to 17.5 million. The running average barely ever crosses 15 million acre feet. The 10-year average, if you look at it, is down here well below 15 million acre feet and closer to 12 million acre feet. So why is it that our reservoirs are dropping, right? Here's Lake Powell, and if we start right at the turn of the millennium, it was almost full at almost 25 million acre feet. Between 2000 and 2004, it dropped down to below 8 million acre feet in the reservoir. Slowly climbed back up, and we had the 2012 and 13 drought, drops back down below 10, climbed back up to just above 15 million, and here we are today, below 10 million. We're at about 37% capacity in that reservoir. So the problem is that is our upper basin savings account. It was designed to do what it's doing here, which is in wet years you store water, and in dry years, even though you may not get as much as you owe to the lower basin, you can still deliver it. And our obligations down below are on a running 10-year average. So it's not every year that we have to meet a certain amount. There is a target, but there is it's a 10-year running average of 75 million acre feet that have to be delivered at that dam every 10 years. The problem is that as we're in compliance, and today I will tell you that we are more than in compliance, even though the reservoir is at this level. If next year was a repeat of 2000 to 2004, that reservoir can't handle that. That reservoir does not have the storage capacity in our savings account to actually meet our obligations. So that scares a lot of us. So you say, well, what's going on and why is this happening? The first thing that's going on is this plain, simple lower basin overuse. They are using, on average, about 1.2 million acre feet more than they are allowed to under the agreements that govern the Colorado River. They have more people and more political power, and Victor's friends and the Bureau of Reclamation have found ways to get them the water that they need. If I can, this is just a document drafted by the Central Arizona Project, the most junior right down below. And they're basically trying to say, look, the real problem here is that we're only getting 8.23 million acre feet, and we should screw with the levels of the reservoir to be able to get 9 million every year. And it's these operating criteria that allow them to do that based on the date at which the level of the reservoir is at a certain level. So they were timing their deliveries to get more water, which then caused Lake Powell to drop further. So this is in Lake Mead. Lake Mead was getting more, Lake Powell was losing. The other thing that's going on we have to recognize is climate change. Colorado has warmed 2 degrees in the last 30 years. And if you look at the trend line over here, that trend line is if I can get it there, 1983 to 2012, right? It doesn't include the 4 hottest years out of four of the hottest years on this record, in this 110 or 120 year record. Those 4 of those last 10 years happened in the last 5 years. So we've got a significant warming trend going on in Colorado. What does that mean for our water supply and our runoff? And what does it mean for the Colorado River? Well, what we found is that for every degree of warming, and 1 degree of Fahrenheit warming, we see a 3 to 4% decline in annual runoff. So it's not a 1-to-1 relationship, it's a 1 to 3 or 1 to 4 relationship. They've tested this on rivers like the Roaring Fork. They did a phenomenal study on that, and were able to show that while it warmed 2 degrees and there was only a 3% change in precipitation, the river dropped 13% between 2000 and 2015, and the flows in the river. And the reason could only be explained by the increase in temperatures. So why does an increase in temperature lead to less water in the river? Well, first of all, the precip falls as rain instead of snow, so there's less efficient runoff. It comes off at different times. It actually gets sucked up by the plant material if it's coming off at different times of the year. There's higher sublimation, meaning direct evaporation from snow into gas, right, into vapor. There's earlier snow melt, so it's earlier, and it runs off a week to 2 weeks earlier. If you look at, for instance, the biggest irrigation project on the western slope, which is down in the Uncompahgre Valley, they are irrigating on the spring side 1 to 2 weeks earlier than they did in the 80s, and they are irrigating 1 to 2 weeks longer in the fall, and some years they've even gone 3 or 4 weeks longer in the fall. It is in that additional use of water, the transpo evaporation from the plants, and it's not just our agricultural crops, it's all of our forests, our riparian vegetation. It's growing longer, it's warmer longer, so it ends up with using more water. And then the soils up high are exposed earlier to melt out, which leads to more evaporation. All of those factors play a role in it. So what does this mean? How do we as a society here in Western Colorado deal with this? And one of the things that the 7 states and the Mexico and the federal government said was, we've got to find a way to bring the river back into balance. Got to get the lower basin and the upper basin to come up with drought contingency plans. And right there, I will tell you, it's a misnomer. right? And when I interviewed for my job 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, I said, I don't even like the word drought contingency plan because it's actually a reality. This is the reality that we're dealing with. The climate has changed, and we are dealing with a different river than we've had. So what do we do? Well, let me first say, if we don't do anything, what will happen? Well, our prior appropriation system will kick in. And the state, what will happen is if we don't deliver enough water down to the lower basin, there will be a call coming up the river. It will cause the Upper Colorado River Commission, a very obscure agency that sits in Salt Lake City, to make a determination, and it's made up of the 4 representatives of the Upper Basin and 1 federal government representative. And they'll make a determination that a curtailment is necessary in each state. And they will determine which each of the states owe to the river, because there's been an overuse. And they will go out and tell the state engineer in our state, figure out a way to get that water to Lake Powell. And under a strict prior appropriation system, if we're in a deficit under the compact, if you just sit back and let it happen, our modeling shows most likely the curtailment will go all the way down to the date of the compact. So every water right that is post-compact will potentially be curtailed if we sit around and wait till that we're in a significant violation and we owe water back to the river. That means that most of the transbasin diversions are junior, 95% of them. It means many of our snowmaking rights. It means Green Mountain Reservoir. It means Wolford Reservoir. It means Dillon. It means every reservoir you've driven by, because almost every reservoir. And so then within our state picture, what we would do as a society, we're not going to turn water off on people's taps. We're going to find a way to get water for critical needs. Our state constitution has a preference called the domestic preference, which means that municipal systems that own and operate critical infrastructure can come out and condemn water rights, such as those that are pre-compact, primarily in West Slope Ag. And so we see that as a very real threat to the fabric of western Colorado. So we don't really want to see that happen. First I want to talk about the lower basin. Remember, they use about 1.1 to 1.2 million acre feet of water too much every year. Well, under the agreement that they've just reached earlier this year, they are going to reduce their use and leave water in Lake Mead depending upon the level of Lake Mead. So as Lake Mead is dropping, they save more water. They use less water. And at the lowest levels of Lake Mead, they're actually reducing their use by 1.1 million acre feet. So they're almost solving their structural deficit, but they're doing it in a way that will keep the system in crisis. So while it's a good step, and it's nice to see them getting along and figuring out how to do this, it is just the first step. It is just the beginning, from our perspective. What are we doing up here? There are several things. I want to say first, those agreements down in the lower basin are solid, meaning they each know, each water contractor from the Department of Interior knows exactly how much water they have to reduce and stop using. In the upper basin, what we said was, we're going to study this issue. We're going to try to figure out what we can do, if anything, to help this situation. The first one is there's something called the Colorado River Storage Project reservoirs. So that's Flaming Gorge, Navajo, and Blue Mesa reservoirs. Those were built to help the upper basin meet its requirements under the compact. So that water can be reoperated or relocated from those reservoirs down into Lake Powell. And that's being done primarily for purposes of maintaining power production at Powell. But as long as you maintain the ability to produce power, you also maintain the ability to meet our compact. So that water at critical periods of time will be moved down the rivers. The next thing we're doing is a cloud seeding and phreatophyte removal. It's an augmentation program. We are at the River District working hand in hand with many partners throughout The Basin engaged in a cloud seeding effort. There are a number of cloud seeders in this region and in Eagle County and Grand County that our program works with and runs, and some in Pitkin County as well. I will tell you that the science on that is in process, and that while we're optimistic that it is bringing 5 to 15% more water on a storm that we're able to seed properly, the question of how much water that actually produces is a little bit more out there. The third one is a fairly controversial one, and this is something that's called demand management, and that's reducing consumptive use intentionally. So everybody, there's a difference between using water efficiently and conserving water. And when you conserve water, there's more water that stays in the river, or returns to the river, that you're not using and evaporating up into the sky or using for your plant material. When you're being more efficient, sometimes you'll put in sprinklers and you'll draw less water out of the river, but your consumption rate, the total amount of water you consume, often goes up with sprinklers because you're growing a more uniform crop with a sprinkler than you are with a flood irrigation. So you're actually consuming more water and taking more water out of the system. So what demand management is about is trying to reduce the consumption of water. Now, what we're trying to do is figure out how you do that on a major scale without harming local economies and creating more harm, frankly, than you would otherwise. The demand management, importantly, is only going to be done to maintain compact compliance. Whereas if you remember the discussion about the reoperation of the reservoirs had to do with maintaining the power level at Powell. We did secure through federal legislation just about a month ago, the 7 states did a non-equalized pool, so it's a pool of water that we can put water in Lake Powell, and the lower basin cannot pull it out. They can't get to it unless the upper Colorado River Commission says they can, unless the upper basin states say. So we have this storage account now available, and we would do it through reducing consumptive use of water. We had a lot of concerns about what we heard in the statewide and the basin-wide discussions. There were people talking about how the water should just come out of agriculture, primarily western slope agriculture. There were people who said, look, it should just be market-based, and our water in big urban centers, whether it's anywhere in the Colorado River Basin or those cities that are outside the basin that depend on it, they said, we're not going to reduce use. We want the farms and ranches to reduce use. We don't really care if your communities go out of business, if that's happening. It's just the way the market works. We said, no, we can't see that happening, and we raised quite a stink last fall at the state level, and our Colorado Water Conservation Board reacted very well. They said, look, we're gonna adopt a policy to set up principles before we ever go near this demand management concept. We're going to talk about protecting communities that depend upon the water. And how do they do that? Well, they're going to say that water has got to come from both the east and the west slope. Anyone with a straw in the Colorado River or its tributaries who's consuming water would have to produce or figure out how to produce their equitable share. Importantly, it's a voluntary, temporary, and compensated program. So if it's going to ever happen, it's not through mandatory curtailment. It's not the one that happens after we're in violation. It would happen before, and it would have to be compensated. And the idea with temporary is that you fallow your land for maybe 3 out of 10 years. The farmer who would have otherwise made money off that crop receives a cash payment, maybe 110, 120% of what that crop would have been. They have some surety in their income stream. But yet we're not putting them out of business. And they may take that money and invest it in whatever they want. It may be on farm improvements. It may be their kids' education. It may be debt payments or a new tractor or a vacation, whatever it may be. But it keeps the money in the agricultural community for those those water right owners to do with what they desire. Again, water from all sectors of the water user community. Urban, industrial, power production, and agriculture. Obviously, we don't want, again, Western Slope Ag to be the sacrifice zone. We do want it consistent with the prior appropriation system, and we don't want to see other water users injured. If I can, I just want to tell you, I think I'm just about out of time here. We do have a seminar in which we'll dive a lot deeper into a number of these issues on the Big River coming up in Grand Junction. We would invite you all to come down to it, and would love to see you down there. I know I just threw a lot of information at you, but if you have questions or concerns, I'd love to talk to you.
Question, a follow-up question. How much does West Slope agriculture use water-wise in Colorado?
The question was, how much water does West Slope agriculture use in the state of Colorado? Western Slope agriculture uses approximately 1.1 to 1.6 million acre feet of water a year, and that's consumes. It consumes that. That's out of approximately 2.5 to 3 million acre feet that the entire state uses. So Western Slope Ag uses quite a bit of water.
Follow-up is, if not sacrificing Western Slope agriculture is isn't it kind of like trying to reduce the federal deficit by not touching Social Security or Medicare or what have you, where most of the money is going?
So the question was, if you don't take water out of Western Slope Ag, aren't you, I'm going to see if I can paraphrase your question. If it's, isn't it like the federal government saying that they're not going to take money out of Social Security to balance the budget because it's such a huge component of the total water budget in the state? And it's not that we're saying that water shouldn't come from Western Slope Ag. We're saying that it should be done in a proportionate basis, and it should be temporary and compensated so that the folks can stay in business and we can continue to have agricultural food production on the Western Slope and other agricultural products that are produced. So it's not that Western Slope Ag shouldn't participate. We're not saying that. We're saying that it needs to be done in a very guided way so that it doesn't have disproportionate impacts on one basin or one project or one river watershed, but it would happen throughout the state. So. Yes, sir.
Yeah, is there a fund for compensation? Where would the money come from?
That's an excellent question. So the question was, where would the money come from? Well, I would say at this point, we're working on that, but there are a number of potential sources, and remember the Colorado River Basin as a whole supports 40 million people in terms of the water supply. All 40 million of those people have a vested interest in keeping this river in balance and avoiding a compact violation. That's true of lower basin folks and upper basin. The litigation and the fighting and the chaos, the economic uncertainty that would break out would be system-wide, basin-wide. So we actually expect to see some of the money coming from the entire 7-basin state area. Federal government, we've talked to them about putting money in various funding mechanisms at the federal level. You may be aware the state legislature just passed an initiative, a referred initiative that will be on the ballot this fall on sports betting. And the largest beneficiary of that will be funding both the water plan and this potential demand management program. So it's things like that. I will tell you there's still a shortfall, so we're looking for ways to resolve that. But it's going to require some very creative thinking. So, yes.
Is cloud seeding no different than diverting another river?
The question is cloud seeding no different than diverting another river? What's really interesting is, what I think what you're saying is, if we seed a cloud here on this side of the Continental Divide, does it mean there's less rain on the eastern slope? And at least the science I've seen says no. That what we're able to get out of the cloud, even though it is a significantly more precipitation than we would otherwise have, because those systems are so large, that there's no appreciable or measurable impact to downwind communities. And in fact, there's cloud seeding that has been going on in the Sierras and even at Vail Resort since the 1960s. and have been studied really closely, and no one's been able to see where we're robbing Peter to pay Paul, if you will. Oddly enough, no. Yes.
Doesn't the compact end in 2022?
No, the compact is a perpetual document. I'm sorry, the question was, does the compact end in 2022? No, it doesn't end in 2022. We have adopted, however, these guidelines that operate, they're called interim guidelines that operate the levels of Lake Powell and Lake Mead and do an integrated water management plan, if you will, between those two reservoirs. And those the current operating guidelines expire in 2026, and that may be what you've heard, because it's all part of this amorphous document or set of laws called the Law of the River. And so the compact itself stays in place unless we modify it. And there's always discussion about how we would love to see it modified to benefit us here in the Upper Basin. I mean, under this, what I just described to you as, because we get the second 7.5 million acre feet, we bear the risks of climate change, if you will. So we'd love to have the lower basin bear that risk or some of that risk. But if we reopen negotiations on that compact in a full-blown way, I think we stand a lot to lose given the political pressure or power that they have down in the lower basin.
Okay, we need to make that the last question. So that was the last question. Thank you very much.